Hello and welcome back to World History Screencast, brought to you by Mr. McShane. Today we're going to be talking about the Renaissance as part of our Unit 3B on the transformation of Europe. And we've already talked a little bit about why the Renaissance began, but today we're going to focus also on why this time period is significant and why it's seen as a transformative time period in world history. So our first essential question is, well, what is the Renaissance? Renaissance literally translates into rebirth. We've talked about some renaissances in the rest of the world, especially the Islamic world and in China. In Europe, it's a rebirth of art, education, and culture, and it's a look back at the classics. You can see in the artwork, architecture, in the right-hand side of the slide, that classical themes in architecture appear once again. Most of these classical themes include domes, columns, Romanesque architecture. And of course, because the Renaissance begins in Italy, the Italians were already close to a lot of the architecture, at least the ruins of what was left from the Roman Empire. There are three key concepts we'll learn about in this unit. First, humanism. Humanism is the belief in not just human sources of knowledge, but also the human potential to improve themselves. During the Renaissance, humans looked back towards the classics, the Greek and Roman art, architecture, but also literature, and began to really focus on education, which is also going to lead to a more literate society. Classical, we'll talk about that a lot. As you see down here, it refers to Greek and Roman. One of the big things about humanism is that the Catholic Church will no longer be the sole source of knowledge. Now, don't get me wrong, the Catholic Church is still incredibly important for Renaissance society, but we're going to see a slow move away from the Catholic Church as being the center of every single part of life. The next key concept is secularism, the idea that people actually will become concerned with worldly issues rather than just the spiritual. In other words, Catholics start to believe that they should also enjoy their life here on earth and not just wait to the afterlife, which was often an excuse given to peasants to explain why they shouldn't try to fight for better conditions or wages or more land, because their suffering here on earth would help them get to the afterlife a lot faster. And we're going to see that's one of the big things that comes up during this time period, especially the middle class, the merchants, and peasants, who some of which move into this middle class, are going to really look to improve their lot in life. The last key theme is individualism. It kind of goes hand in hand with these other two things. It's part of this belief, this humanist belief, that individuals have the ability to accomplish great things. But it's a pretty critical transformation away from the typical life in medieval Europe, which was more focused on communal living, life centered around the church, everybody living and working together for a common cause. And of course, that was reinforced by the feudal system, where everybody on a lord's manor would have been working to produce crops for one person. You can see in the artwork on the right-hand side that one of the things that keeps popping up is secular themes in art, especially during the Northern Renaissance, which is something we'll talk about. Van Eyck, a Dutch painter, paints this scene here of a marriage of two people. This will be a painting we'll discuss later. Another sculpture here, Michelangelo, one of the famous Ninja Turtles that we'll talk about during the Renaissance art lesson, created a statue in the rounds. Now, this statue is an example of individualism because it depicts the revival of the classics and the focus on the realistic human form, which wasn't something that was very important for medieval art. The next essential question is, why is this a time of transition in Europe? As you can see from the map, Europe had been divided into a number of different smaller kingdoms, but now it's going to transition into a time period of the creation of nation states. One of the things we'll see in the transition from the medieval to the modern world is the formation of strong, centralized governments. Medieval Europe was decentralized. Great Britain, for example, was decentralized by the Magna Carta. Even Britain during the Renaissance will start to be united by stronger kings. Nation states will form for a number of reasons. One of the most important things is that the merchant class begins to threaten and challenge the power of the nobility, the main threat to the power of the kings. With the nobles losing power, kings were able to gain power by including merchants in their government and actually using them to create a bureaucracy. Powerful kings will eventually begin to win control over France, England, Spain, and many other countries. One of the exceptions, though, is Italy. This is very, very early to talk about nationalism, but there is a sense of national identity. French people begin to think of themselves as French, or subjects of King Charles VII. Englishmen think of themselves as English, subjects of Henry VII, and so on and so forth. They start to identify themselves with a nation, which is defined by many different characteristics, including language, religion, etc., rather than by their region. And that's a really important theme that's going to grow in importance as we move through the next couple centuries. Interestingly enough, the place where the Renaissance started was the Italian city-states. And as you saw from the lesson we did yesterday, the Italian city-states potentially were the starting place for the Renaissance because they were decentralized. So the fact that things are becoming more centralized and nation states are forming isn't sweeping. It's not going to cover every single part that's affected by the Renaissance. So we see here the Italian city-states are actually an outlier, and they are going to revive some of the classical ideas of a republican form of government. In practice, though, even though some people got a chance to vote, these governments were mainly oligarchies, or strong merchant or noble families took control over the government. Venice, Milan, Naples, Florence all gained prominence because of trade, the thing we talked about in the last part of this unit. Overseas trade, really starting with the Silk Road, begins to or encourages independence for these different city-states. One of the arguments you saw from why the Renaissance begins in Italy is that decentralization allowed for a republican form of government to form and allowed for a lot more competition and art to develop. Speaking of competition, the Renaissance economy is extremely linked to the stuff we just learned about in the last chapter, and that's why we studied overseas expansion first. Without the Silk Road trade, without overseas expansion into the Indian Ocean and America, a lot of the transformations we see in the Renaissance never happen because they don't have the wealth necessary to create these transformations. So as overseas commerce grew, more and more countries in Europe began to get involved in the Renaissance. The wealth from Asia and then eventually America fuels the revival of European culture, art, and education. The Renaissance, as we talked about in Italy, is born from the Silk Road. Because if you look at when it starts in the 14th century, this is before Vasco da Gama and other Portuguese sailors even make their way around the southern coast of Africa to get to India. Italian banks are some of the first to allow merchants to exchange goods from one place to the next and start to grow the beginnings of a capitalist economy in Europe. Once we get into the Atlantic Ocean and greater Indian Ocean trade with the triangular trade, for example, then we start to see northern places in Europe develop, especially England, France, the Netherlands, etc. All these countries we just talked about getting involved in overseas trade are now using that money to bolster the cultural revolutions we're going to see with the Renaissance. So the Northern Renaissance is really linked to overseas exploration and colonization, particularly in the Americas. Mercantilism is a system, an economic system that helps to bolster the Renaissance. Mercantilism is an economic system based on governments trying to amass as much gold and silver as they can. And the way they do this is by selling more goods than they buy, exporting more than they import. The significance of this is that the American colonies will enable the European nations to amass wealth. In other words, as you can see over here, raw materials from the colonies will flow over to places like Britain, where they will be turned into manufactured goods and shipped back to the colonies and sold. This will not only amass wealth for the country, but strengthen the power of these kings. Another thing that changes during this time period is the Renaissance society. We're going to talk about that in the next slide.